Hi folks, welcome to day 36. Today we're going to be going through section 9.1 and we'll be working on rewriting exponential functions today. So last week we learned all about exponential growth and decay, and the most basic form is y equals ab to the x. We also learned that sometimes they're written like y equals a times 1 plus or minus r to the t. Just depends on what type of situation you're working with. Well, I told you last week that these exponential growth and decay functions come in handy and come in use in the real world all the time. But oftentimes, we have to rewrite them so that way they fit into this format, this y equals ab to the x format. So sometimes what will happen is instead of y equals ab to the x, you might have like y equals like a times b to the 3x, right? In this case, a and b are 3 and 2, respectively. All right, but what we have to do, since we have only an x up here, right, in our formula, we can't deviate from our formula, so we have to rewrite our new problem in terms of our old formula. Now remember that 3x is the same thing as 3 times x, right? So that means that this new function could be written instead of 3 times 2 to the 3x, we could write it as 3 times 2 to the 3 times x. Now that might seem like a small deviation or a small change, but when we do that, it then allows us to go in and put in a new set of parentheses, all right? Because remember, there's something called the power of a power, right? The power of a power rule, or the power of a power property from exponents. Remember, that's when you have some exponent on the outside of another exponent, right? Or an exponent being raised to another exponent. And we said that's the same thing as multiplying. So because we know power of a power, we can actually use it to split up our new situation, right, our new scenario. And the nice part is when we do that, right, we can then eliminate our blue parentheses, and then we have y equals 3 times 2 raised to the third power to the x. So in order to find out what this would look like in y equals ab to the x format, all we have to do is evaluate 2 to the third power, or 2 times 2 times 2. So then we have y equals 3, 2 to the third power is 8 to the x. All right, so by just bringing this 3 inside our parentheses, right, we still left it as an exponent, but we brought it inside the parentheses and then evaluated, right, our base number to that power. And when we did that, we are then left with a solution or a simplified version of our original equation that is now in exponential form. All right, now it looks like an exponential growth or decay. Your final step in problems like this would be to ask yourself, all right, so we have this 8, okay, is that bigger than 1 or smaller than 1? Remember, if that b value is bigger than 1, we call it a growth. But if the b value is less than 1, we call it a decay. So since our b value is bigger than 1, we'd say that this is an exponential growth function. Now I know some of you might be like, oh, but isn't that obvious that it's an exponential growth function? And the answer is, well, not really. If we had something more like, if we had something that looked more like y equals 200 times let's say times 1.5, all right, raised to the 2x over 3 power. All right, so our goal with this one is to rewrite this in terms of an exponential function, just like we did with our first example, and then once we've done that, we will evaluate our exponent, all right? Well, in order to do that, I should say, we have to evaluate our exponent. All right, so first off, I'm going to rewrite my exponent that I have here. Instead of a 2x over 3, I know that that's the same thing as 2/3 times x. So I can rewrite that as 1.5 to the 2/3 times x. And when I do that, I can add in my new set of parentheses and raise my 1.5 to the 2/3 power. And 1.5 raised to the 2/3 power is about 1.31. With these problems, you'll end up getting lots of ugly decimals because remember, fractional exponents are the same thing as radicals, right? So essentially you're taking the square roots and the cubed roots of ugly numbers, so you get uglier numbers. If you get a decimal, that's okay. Totally expected. Just remember to usually you should round to about 2 decimal places. That's usually plenty. But what you have to remember is that a decimal, right, like 0.75 is less than 1, but it's also the same thing as 3/4. So sometimes you might have to remember how your decimals switch into fractions, all right? For this case, though, since we have this now fully simplified, our last step is to identify if it's a growth or a decay. Remember, all we have to do is look at our B. Our B is 1.31. That's still bigger than 1. It's just 0.31 bigger than 1, but it's still bigger than 1. So we call it an exponential growth. All right, so that's what you're going to be doing today is those like basic steps of bringing in that exponent inside of those parentheses. Now remember that you might have something that looks like 2x. You might have something that looks like 2x over 3, which we'd rewrite as 2/3 x, right, like we just did. Or you might have something that looks like x over 3. Now remember, x is the same thing as 1 times x, so that's the same thing as 1/3 times x. All right, so the first one, the 2x, is really easy to see where it's 2 times x. Some of you might get confused with the second half, right, the second 2 examples, and that's because they have fractions in them. Don't worry about the fractions. Just take away the fractions, all right? So you can see I had my 2/3 times, and then I had the x, so I had 2x over 3. So now I have 2 over 3 times x, same thing. Here we had x over 3, so I pull out that over 3 part, right? We have to have that 1 up top, so we have 1/3 times the x. All right, so that's going to be your trickiest part. I'll let you know right now is some of you are going to forget that this x over 3 has that implied 1 right there, okay? So don't forget the implied 1. So that's tip number 1. Remember implied 1. All right. That's a 1. It doesn't look like a 1, but it's an implied. So there's always an implied 1 when you're multiplying. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is when you're doing the evaluation piece, right? 1.5 to the 2/3. In your calculator, you'll have to type 1.5 and then either the caret button or the like y to the x button, depending on your calculator. The caret button is just this upward arrow looking thing. All right. And then you'll have to type a parentheses and then 2 divided by 3, close parentheses, then put equals. If you do not include those parentheses, you will likely get an error. You won't always get an error, but 9 times out of 10, you will get an error, okay? So make sure that you're including these parentheses. So tip number 1, remember there's always an implied 1 in your numerator. Tip number 2, remember that you always have to include the parentheses around your exponents, okay? Especially when it's a fractional exponent. That's all I have for you today. Go ahead and try out your practice problems and shoot me an email if you have any questions.